Looks like everybody's seated. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations is going to start, and I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'm Morgan Griffith. It's good to be with you all this evening. I welcome you all to our first Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee hearing of the 118th Congress, and I would like to congratulate Ranking Member Kathy Castor on her appointment to that post.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to have somebody to work with. This afternoon's subcommittee hearing will explore the importance of pandemic origin investigations as a means of bolstering our country's pandemic preparedness and biodefense capabilities. To date, over 1 million Americans have died from COVID-19. The pandemic brought our country to a standstill. It cost our economy around $15 trillion in economic damage. Businesses were shut down. Schools were closed. The nation is still recovering from the pandemic's impact and the damage that it caused. It has been a little over 3 years since COVID-19 emerged, and questions on its origins remain. Given the toll of the virus has taken, that's unacceptable. I believe the substantial circumstantial evidence favors COVID-19 emerging due to a research-related incident, but this committee will continue to investigate the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic since we have jurisdiction over public health and federal biomedical research. Today, though, we will look beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and understand what structures, technologies, and capacities are needed to more clearly investigate the origins of disease outbreaks in the future. Being able to quickly identify the root cause of a disease outbreak or biological incident has important benefits ranging from countermeasure development to differentiating between whether an outbreak was due to a deliberate release, an accidental release, or a natural event. By all accounts, the risk of catastrophic biological incidents and infectious disease pandemics is increasing. As the world becomes more connected, barriers that once helped limit disease from spreading across the globe are being removed. Further, human-animal interactions are also increasing. The last 2 decades have seen a global proliferation of laboratories conducting research on potential pandemic pathogens, increasing the possibility that future pandemics may have a research-related origin. Of the approximately 60 biosafety level 4 labs which are designed to work on the most dangerous of pathogens that are around the globe, at least 20 have been built in the last decade. More than 75% of these labs are located in urban centers where a virus, if it escaped, could spread with ease. As an aside, the Wuhan Institute of Virology appears to have conducted at least some high-risk coronavirus research at a biosafety level 2 lab. In the United States, we have recently seen high-risk research done to intentionally modify pathogens, such as NIH's experiments to enhance monkeypox's virulence, as well as conflicting reports as to what coronavirus research Pfizer is conducting to anticipate future variants. Although there's little we can do to predict the timing of the next outbreak, there's a lot we can do now to prepare for that next outbreak. Currently, there's no coordinated whole of government plan for investigating the origins of a disease outbreak or a biological incident. However, as our witnesses will testify today, a coordinated approach across the government, academia, and the private sector is needed. The focus of today's hearing will be a Government Accountability Office technical assessment on the technologies and challenges for investigating the origins of pandemics. This study was conducted at the request of all 26 Republicans on the committee in June 2021 and is based on insights GAO gained by working with the National Academies of Science and the leading pandemic experts in the U.S. This GAO report is significant because it is believed to be the first standalone, detailed document that specifically identifies what technologies and areas of scientific expertise are needed to conduct rigorous pandemic origin investigations. Existing pandemic preparedness plans have mentioned the need for investigating the origins of pandemics, but have neither spelled out the challenges nor the specifics of how to conduct an effective probe. One of the challenges laid out in the report is the need for investigators to have more access to samples from early cases in order to be effective in determining the pandemic's origin. We must address this issue since some government organizations, including the government of the Chinese Communist Party, have a history of withholding this type of information. This report and upcoming hearing can provide the basis for a bipartisan effort to improve our biodefense strategies by incorporating details on investigative approaches and taking the recommended actions. Speaking for the Republicans on this subcommittee, we look forward to working with our Democrat colleagues constructively to deliver solutions and pave a path forward for America to work in common purpose for the greater good. I eagerly await today's discussion and learning more about how to best address these complex issues. I also want to thank the witnesses for being here today and for being a part of this discussion. And I apologize we're starting late, but that's what happens with votes. And with that, I yield back to myself and now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Griffith. I'm pleased to be here as the ranking member for the first hearing of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations in the 118th Congress, along with some outstanding Democratic colleagues and our professional staff. And congratulations to you, my friend and colleague. I look forward to working with you in the months ahead. This committee's jurisdiction touches on so many critical issues that affect the everyday lives of our neighbors, from the ability to access life-saving health care to ensuring that we provide clean energy solutions at lower costs for consumers and provide a more livable planet for our children and future generations. We have the ability in this subcommittee to ensure that our policies are carried out in a way that helps Americans in the ways we intended. And when we shine a light on the challenges and shortcomings, we should work together on solutions that will improve our government's ability to help our neighbors back home. Today's hearing addresses one component of our evolving ability to respond to a pandemic, identifying a pandemic's origin, and focusing on the tools to prevent the next one. Understanding the origin of a pandemic is useful to inform the necessary public health response. For example, if a virus is found to have jumped from a particular species of animal to humans, we can take steps to better monitor that species of animal and improve the necessary handling procedures to mitigate future risk. Pinpointing the origin of a disease is a piece of information that can be used in developing public health policies and for conducting further research. But it must be accompanied by informed leadership that supports good science, that listens to experts, and rallies the public to act together for the common good, including, for example, encouraging the use of safe and effective vaccines. Putting this information into action requires that government officials, especially our leaders at the state and federal level, take seriously the threat that a pandemic poses. I appreciate the work that the Government Accountability Office put into the report at the center of today's hearing. There is a lot in that report to understand, and I look forward to doing that with this expert panel of witnesses. The GOA makes some sensible policy recommendations that could contribute to a stronger national public health system, increasing collaboration across borders, developing new technologies for researchers, standardizing and improving transparency and collected data, and strengthening our scientific workforce. I hope we can have a continuing discussion in this committee and subcommittee on how we can work towards all of those goals. I do have to mention that this hearing was sprung on us with short notice before the committee was even formally organized, and I will let others judge whether there really is a good cause that warrants an exception to the notice requirement here. But either way, it does limit the ability of members and witnesses to prepare themselves on complicated topics. In her remarks at the committee organizing meeting yesterday, Chair Rogers mentioned the importance of trust in doing the work that we do. I agree strongly with that sentiment. And I trust that going forward, for the sake of constructive oversight work, we can ensure that members, staff, and witnesses have the lead time necessary to tackle the complex issues that come before the subcommittee, as we have done in the past. I want to close my remarks by noting that in December, before the 118th Congress even began, then incoming chairs of two other subcommittees sent the administration excessive document demands and a laundry list of dozens of public servants at our health agencies who they sought to interview in a witch hunt over the origin of the current pandemic. That generates the exact kind of hostility and fear in the scientific community that the GAO report warns about, stating that researchers may experience unwanted attention, pressure, harassment, or influence because of their involvement in pandemic origin investigations, and that experienced researchers may refuse to participate in such investigations as a result. Democrats will not ignore bad faith efforts to erode trust in science, or impede the work of scientists defending the health and safety of the American people. I appreciate Chair Rogers and Chairman Griffith that this subcommittee has begun its work in a different manner by bringing in serious witnesses to navigate today's challenging topic. And I truly hope that as we continue the committee's important oversight work in this area and in others, that we do so in that same spirit. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, gentlelady. Now yield 5 minutes to the chair of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rogers, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you convening this hearing about the challenges and the opportunities around investigating the origins of pandemics and other biological events. And congratulations on becoming the chairman of this important subcommittee, and to the ranking member.
Thank you for letting me do it.
Ms. Castor, congratulations on becoming the ranking member. Look forward to working with you, and I am fully committed to building trust. This week was an exception when it came to the notices for the hearings this week due to issues on both sides of the aisle that had come up at the beginning, but I am committed to abiding by the rules. I want the members to be prepared fully for every committee hearing. The COVID-19 pandemic has been catastrophic for the United States and the world. And I think about the people who have lost loved ones, many times without the chance to say goodbye, the first responders who worked around the clock, day and night, and every person who served on the front lines to provide hope and comfort in our communities. Government-enforced lockdowns and school closures have hurt our children's well-being, mentally, physically, and academically. In addition, the pandemic cost the United States economy more than $15 trillion. Consider the hundreds of thousands of people whose businesses were shuttered, whose livelihoods were uprooted, who lost everything. We owe it. We have a responsibility to every American to get to the bottom of the origins of COVID-19. Investigating the origins of COVID-19 has been very difficult and challenging. Some of the hurdles we face are because of inherent scientific challenges. For reference, it took 13 years to determine the origins of the SARS outbreak. In addition, the Chinese government has lied to America and the global health community on information related to COVID-19. This is unacceptable, and my hope is that we will join together in our search for the origins of the pandemic with the same bipartisan unity that an airplane crash investigation or other tragedy would receive. The lesson learned is that we have to treat investigating the origins of pandemics as a part of a pandemic preparedness with a single point of accountability within the federal government. According to a paper recently released by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, quote, there does not appear to be a single office within the United States government that owns the challenge of bioattribution. We need a plan, we need a point person, and we need greater accountability. In response to a request from the Energy and Commerce Republicans, GAO conducted a technical assessment on the origins of pandemics. This report examined 1, key technologies available for pandemic investigations, 2, strengths and limitations of these tools, and 3, the cross-cutting challenges researchers face in determining a pandemic's origin. The GAO's technical assistance is perhaps the first standalone document that addresses the issue of investigating the origins of pandemics in great detail. The need for pandemic origins determinations has been noted in other documents, but preparation for investigating the origins of a pandemic or other serious biological events has not been treated as a major component of biodefense strategy. The GAO detailed the difficulties with such investigations, including lack of sufficient access to samples and genetic sequence data, lack of standardized processing for submitting, accessing, and using genetic sequence data, lack of experts in certain fields. Overall, we must be united in our efforts to investigate the origins of COVID-19 pandemic and prepare for future pandemics. It is the public health question of our generation. We cannot afford to be divided. It will hurt our ability to prepare for the next pandemic, which could be more severe. The evidence and the experts tell us that the risk of pandemic are increasing for various reasons, such as a surge in international travel or more development in remote areas that leads to more human interaction with animals and novel viruses. We need to be better prepared. Our goal is for today's hearing to inform bipartisan efforts on this committee toward reauthorizing pandemic preparedness legislation. I thank the witnesses for their participation, and I do thank you for participating on short notice. We appreciate your cooperation and look forward to the hearing. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you and our ranking member here today and leading this committee on both sides of the aisle. I welcome the opportunity to begin what I hope will be a constructive Congress overseeing the ongoing response to COVID-19 and evaluating lessons learned so that we can be ready to prevent and tackle future biological threats facing Americans. We all know too well from COVID-19 that biological threats are persistent. They're likely to become even more common due to climate change, urbanization, globalization. In order to improve our response to future pandemics, it is critical that healthcare experts are able to research viruses and where they came from in order to quickly identify, sequence, and understand emerging diseases. And this research allows us to develop countermeasures to help prevent death and disease. Now, none of this is possible without ongoing long-term government support for scientific research. As an example, it was Congress's decades-long investment in basic research that enabled virologists and researchers to develop safe and reliable COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines in record speed. And now the Biden administration is taking it one step further with the implementation of its National Biodefense Strategy. This strategy presents another opportunity to encourage collaboration amongst government and research sectors, enhance our capacity to prevent biological incidents before they happen, and respond to pandemics when they occur. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy recently convened a group of experts in immunology and virology to discuss how to develop our national expertise in identifying pandemic origins. I understand that at least one of our witnesses was in attendance, and I look forward to hearing about how Congress can further support productive collaboration between the research community and government in the future. It's important to remember that any inquiry into the origins of pandemics is merely one component of a broader strategy to protect Americans from viral disease and prevent future virological episodes. Therefore, as we discuss the origins inquiry, I think we should keep a couple of principles in mind. First, investigating pandemic origins is useful insofar as it helps us fulfill government's primary responsibility, protecting the health and well-being of citizens. Understanding past pandemics is essential to understanding future ones. For example, as our witnesses described in their written testimonies, lessons learned from the studies of SARS-1, MERS, and H1N1 gave us the tools and infrastructure to quickly understand SARS-CoV-2 during the early COVID-19 outbreak. The lessons learned also enabled the record speed development of monoclonal antibodies and drug therapies. Unfortunately, it's only a matter of time before the next pandemic occurs, and it's critical that we apply the lessons that the research community has learned from COVID-19 to refine our abilities to identify, prevent, and respond to biological threats. The second principle, we must incorporate origin investigations into holistic funding and support of our public health infrastructure. This includes everything from strengthening our healthcare system, tackling the increase in zoonotic health risks caused by climate change, and creating an enabling environment for research and scientific collaboration. Third principle, we must keep politics out of any investigation. Instead, it must be guided by science and evidence rather than conjecture and speculation. And I do have deep concerns that any origins investigation will turn political, which would be extremely harmful to public health. As a recent report by the GAO found, the current acrimony surrounding the overly partisan rhetoric of the COVID-19 origins debate could push researchers out of the field just at a time when we need this critical workforce to be strong. The broad-based research bans and moratoria have taken the place of constructive conversations about improvements to biosecurity. And this has put a chilling effect on research that the American people depend on to retain our competitive edge globally and to achieve medical and scientific breakthroughs. If we're not following the right evidence, we won't learn the right lessons. Democrats are committed to following the scientific evidence to where it leads so that we can make sure that any origins inquiry leads to tangible improvements in the life of Americans. So I welcome this opportunity to examine the remaining barriers to properly identifying pandemic origins as part of our broader efforts to protect the health and well-being of Americans. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. That now concludes our member opening statements. Chair would like to take this opportunity to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements that they would like to submit will be made a part of the record. All right, now we're getting close to y'all now. We want to thank you all for being here today and taking the time to testify before this subcommittee. Each witness will have an opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. And I assume that you all know the timing schedule. You have 5 minutes. Yellow light means you got a minute left. Red light means you're over time, and I may have to call you down. But it won't be harsh. So first, let me recognize Dr. Karen L. Howard, Acting Chief Scientist. Thought we did that after we introduced them. Yeah, I'll do that afterwards. So first, let me introduce Dr. Karen L. Howard, Acting Chief Scientist, Director of Science and Technology Assessment, Science, Technology Assessment Analytics, U.S. Government Accountability Office. Dr. Tom Inglesby, Director, Center for Health Security, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Asha, thank you, I apologize. M. George, Executive Director of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense. And at this point, I would like to recognize Dr. Burgess to introduce our next witness. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank and introduce Dr. Jerry Parker for testifying today. Dr. Parker brings vast experience accrued over decades of service in public health, biodefense, and the military. Notably, he was an asset to our nation's federal response to COVID-19 and the 2001 anthrax attacks. He now serves as Associate Vice President for Public Health Preparedness and Response and a Principal Investigator of the Texas A&M Center for Innovation and Advanced Development and Manufacturing. Prior to his appointment at Texas A&M, Dr. Parker was Deputy Secretary of Defense for Chemical and Biological Defense and the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at Department of Health and Human Services. He also served at the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to his civilian government service, Dr. Parker held a variety of assignments during his impressive 26-year military career in the United States Army. Thank you again, Dr. Parker, for your service and for being willing to testify and help us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. And now I will introduce Ms. Dingle. Had hoped to be here to introduce you, but as we said earlier, there were a number of meetings going on and people are bouncing in and out, and I apologize for that. But I would like to introduce Dr. Michael Imperali. Did I get that right? Close. He is the Arthur Thurnau Professor at the University of Michigan Medical School. Thank you so much for being with us. And as you know, the testimony that you're about to give is subject to Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. When holding an investigative hearing, this committee has the practice of taking testimony under oath. Does anyone have an objection to testifying under oath? Seeing no objections, we'll move forward. And also, the chair would advise you that under the rules of the House and the rules of this committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Does anyone wish to be advised by counsel during their testimony today? Again, based on nods of head, no one has requested the opportunity to have counsel present with them at this time. In that case, if the witnesses would please rise, this is where we get to standing up again, and raise your right hand, and I'll swear you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All of it have stated affirmatively that they will tell the truth. All right. We appreciate it. Now you can return to your seats. Thank you all, and I will now recognize Dr. Howard for 5 minutes to give her opening statement.
Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee.
I am pleased to be here today to discuss our report on technologies, challenges, and policy options for pandemic origin investigations. In the last 20 years, several pandemics have led to significant loss of life and economic disruption. Pandemics can arise from natural sources, notably transmission from animals to humans. Pandemics could also emerge from laboratory work, either through an accidental infection in the lab or through release of a pathogen from a lab. By conducting timely, effective pandemic origin investigations, we can learn more about how these diseases arise and reduce high-risk activities to prevent future outbreaks or limit their impact. In our report, we identified several technologies that can help establish pandemic origins. Chief among these is genetic sequence analysis, which identifies the genetic sequence of a pathogen and compares it to the sequences of known pathogens stored in databases. Researchers also gather evidence for pandemic origins by analyzing blood samples, tracking the spread of the disease through a population, and conducting laboratory-based studies to better understand how the disease may be transmitted. These techniques are mature and have been used to establish the likely origins of several previous pandemics. However, experts told us that origin investigations are hindered by three non-technological challenges. First, the lack of sufficient access to samples and sequence data. There can be many reasons for this. For example, there is often a lack of awareness of the need to collect and store samples for later use, especially early in an outbreak. Other reasons include privacy concerns, national sovereignty, and the possibility of negative consequences for sharing information. The second challenge is the lack of standardized database processes. There are many databases, both public and private, for storing genetic sequence data. These databases were often designed for other purposes and may not ideally suit the needs of origin investigators. Experts told us that the user interfaces can be cumbersome, especially when trying to work across multiple databases. Crucial data may be missing or unreliable, and the rapidly increasing volume of data will likely strain the limits of available infrastructure and computing power. The third challenge is the lack of a sufficient interdisciplinary workforce. The need and the resources to support an appropriate workforce often fluctuate as pandemics rise and then wane. There is uneven global distribution of the skilled staff we do have. There are silos between the many disciplines needed for this work. And some researchers told us they faced criticism because of their involvement in determining pandemic origins, which can cause skilled researchers to avoid the field. We identified 5 policy options that could help address these challenges. One key option is for policymakers to proactively establish multinational agreements to collect, store, and share samples and data. Taking this step in advance would allow for rapid mobilization of the protocols at the earliest signs of an outbreak, when the data and samples are most critical for determining origins. Ideally, such agreements would clearly delineate roles and responsibilities, as well as collaboration and coordination mechanisms. Other policy options include developing standardized processes for database submission and access, along with improved user interface tools, and investing in the training and retention of skilled staff. We also identified a 5th cross-cutting option: development of a detailed national strategy targeted specifically toward pandemic origin investigations. Such a strategy could address all 3 key challenges and improve the ability of experts to more effectively investigate future pandemics. In conclusion, pandemic origin investigations can be facilitated by current technologies, but still face key challenges that hinder the ability of the U.S. and other nations to respond effectively and reduce the likelihood and severity of future pandemics. Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I would be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you very much, and now recognize Dr. Inglesby for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chair Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the chance to speak with you today. I want to commend you for focusing on how to build our capacity to determine the source of future pandemic and biological events. This capacity could help us diminish the chance of those events, whether they were to come from a natural source, a lab accident, or the deliberate use of a biological weapon from a U.S. adversary. If bioattribution efforts around future biological events showed that a certain animal management practice was responsible for an event, that practice could be stopped. If it showed something started in a lab, the responsible lab practices could be ended or changed. If it showed a biological event was deliberately started, it would have national security consequences. The capacity to determine the source of a biological event would be a form of deterrent against such attacks in the first place. And strong attribution tools could help the U.S. to avoid being deliberately deceived about the source, debunking false flag efforts by adversaries who try to assign blame to a country that had no responsibility for it. Attribution science is also critical in the work to grow the U.S. bioeconomy, which is a growing dynamic part of the U.S. economy. These tools can help us protect the biotech products that the U.S. creates, whether they are crops, food, energy, medicines, or other biologically produced materials. Biological attribution science relies on a range of approaches and data sets, including genetic sequencing, bioinformatics, and access to genetic databases in the U.S. and around the world. A recent White House OSTP meeting on strengthening bioattribution highlighted the need for establishing more robust international databases, for funding the science base, applying machine learning tools to this endeavor, and integrating data across government. I strongly support the 5 GAO recommendations in their report, including the importance of international sequence sharing, strong standards for databases around the world and in the U.S., improving tools for this work, building the workforce we need, and setting national strategy. Much of the key science resides outside government, either in research universities or the private sector, so the government should be funding the development of that science. The administration's National Biodefense Strategy, which came out in October 2022, does commit to strengthening national attribution capacity. And now the administration, with the support of Congress, should identify specific agency responsibilities around that work, goals, timelines, and budget requirements. And my intuition is that more funding is needed for this work, and possibly new authorities for data collection are needed, but that obviously is something that the Congress will be looking into and making conclusions about. In conclusion, the U.S. doesn't have yet the scientific research and databases, operational plans, or international partnerships that can reliably identify the source of future pandemics and biological events. Building this capacity will have great benefit to protecting health, national security, and the bioeconomy, and so should be a high priority for the administration and Congress now. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. And we'll now recognize Dr. George for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about federal biological attribution activities. Those activities undertaken to investigate the source and cause of pandemics and other biological events. I also see Chair McMorris-Rogers and Ranking Member Pallone, and very much appreciate your attendance as well. I am Dr. Asham George, Executive Director of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, which is co-chaired by former Senator Joe Lieberman and Governor Tom Ridge. They and the rest of our commissioners send you their greetings and thank you for examining this critical element of national biodefense today. Our commission released its first report, A National Blueprint for Biodefense, in 2015. In it, we warned that the nation was catastrophically vulnerable to biological threats and that the government needed to take bold, immediate action to eliminate those vulnerabilities. Congress and the administrations have taken up a number of our recommendations since 2015, including establishing requirements for a national biodefense strategy, an annual biodefense budgetary crosscut, and biological intelligence management, all of which were recommendations we made in our blueprint. But much remains to be done. We are in the unenviable position of having to prepare for more biological events while still responding to and recovering from COVID-19. Our experience with this pandemic shows that even a single difficult-to-control disease can produce devastating consequences for the world. We must develop better ways to respond to biological events and better determine how and why they arise. The anthrax events of 2001, laboratory accidents, and various pandemics such as H1N1, H5N1, Ebola, SARS, MERS, and of course COVID have time and again revealed our lack of coordination and capability to fully understand and make decisions regarding the origins of biological threats. Regardless, there is still no formal biological attribution apparatus in place. Many federal departments and agencies bear responsibility for biological attribution or some part of it, yet most of their efforts remain uncoordinated. Law enforcement, public health, agriculture, intelligence, military, diplomatic, science, commerce, and other communities all have roles to play, but largely operate independently. The nation needs a robust biological attribution framework, and they need it now. Our commission recommends that Congress direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services, in coordination with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of the Interior, the Attorney General, and the Director of National Intelligence, to establish a federal interagency working group to develop this national biological attribution apparatus with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and requirements, and milestones for adjudicating attribution information and informing decisions following any biological event with national security implications. The Commission also recommends an overhaul of the Federal Select Agent Program in order to reduce our vulnerability to laboratory accidents and improve our ability to determine whether a laboratory inadvertently released a disease into the environment. Additionally, the Commission included recommendations in its Athena agenda about 15 science and technology priority areas that we believe are important to achieve an Apollo program for biodefense. These included genetic sequencing, pathogen surveillance, data analytics, outbreak forecasting, and synthetic biology. All of these could provide valuable contributions to investigations into the origins of pandemics. We have submitted 4 of our reports, along with my written testimony containing recommendations addressing biological attribution and related enablers, for the record and for your consideration. Later this year, our Commission will release the 2nd edition of the National Blueprint for Biodefense, taking into account successes and challenges since 2015. The blueprint will provide a roadmap for continued efforts by the legislative branch and the executive branch to address national biodefense. We hope you will consider these recommendations as you continue the important oversight, investigation, and authorization activities of this committee. Thank you again for the opportunity to come before you today on behalf of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense. I would like to thank Hudson Institute for serving as our fiscal sponsor, our donors for supporting our work, and speaking as former congressional staff, I'd like to thank the congressional staff for their tireless efforts to address this important topic. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize Dr. Parker for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chairperson Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Griffin, Ranking Member Castor, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to appear before you today for this hearing, Challenges and Opportunities to Investigating Origin of Pandemics and Other Biological Threats. Congressman Burgess, I'm honored by the introduction today, so thank you very much for that. And the only thing I might add is I'm also a former commander of USAMR at the Army's Maximum Biocontainment Lab, but this was 20 years ago, but my experience there I think is very relevant to this topic. Naturally occurring infectious disease outbreaks with pandemic potential are occurring with alarming increased frequency. In addition to natural biological threats, diffusion of advanced technologies, worldwide expansion of high containment labs with uneven biosafety and biosecurity controls, and access to dangerous pathogens are increasing the possibility of unnatural, accidental, or deliberate outbreaks. Unfortunately, global capacities and international agreements needed to investigate and rapidly attribute unknown emerging infectious disease outbreaks are inadequate. Outbreak investigations are a core competency of public health, especially where scientists are familiar with known diseases of natural origin within their borders. In cases and within the United States, public health has an exemplary record where their investigations are geared to rapidly find the source, to prevent additional cases, and learn how to prevent future outbreaks. That is the same objective for investigating the source of a pandemic, whether natural or unnatural. Now I would like to share just one example that actually impacted me directly. Exactly 1 week after the tragic events of September 11, 2001, letters containing lethal anthrax spores were postmarked and mailed. The anthrax letter attacks marked the first significant act of bioterrorism in the United States. That deliberate incident highlighted our vulnerability to rapid onset infectious diseases, whether deliberate, natural, or accidental.
The attack also highlighted our inability to rapidly investigate an unnatural outbreak. As you recall, the FBI attributed the perpetrator to a lone U.S. scientist from the lab I once commanded, USAMRIID. Unfortunately and tragically, the scientist committed suicide as the FBI was planning his indictment in 2008, so the case was never tried in a court of law. Attribution to determine who is responsible for deliberate or negligent accidental breach that leads to a community outbreak, or worse, is essential to hold those responsible for their actions, prevent future outbreaks, and serve as a deterrent. Attribution and supporting microbial forensic science are also important to exonerate and rule out suspected perpetrators or negligent actions. Investigations with forensic rigor for natural outbreaks that lead to a pandemic are equally important due to the enormous toll on societies worldwide. There must be trust in the outcome of the investigation and confidence a future pandemic will be prevented. The experience with COVID-19 and past precedent confirm there are no effective international agreements, protocols, or guidelines that provide needed authority to rapidly attribute the source of a pandemic or other biological threats. Multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization have mechanisms to aid member states investigate within their own borders if requested. The Biological and Toxin and Weapons Convention has a framework to adjudicate allegations of suspected treaty violations. However, both have inherent limitations that hinder their ability to rapidly investigate transborder infectious diseases. Their inherent limitations are amplified during periods of geopolitical tension and enhanced power rivalries. The biggest challenge to improving our ability to rapidly attribute the source of a pandemic reside in overcoming these geopolitical forces. Otherwise, samples to test, database access, and ability to examine all source information will not be available or independently verifiable. But there are opportunities that reside through enhanced, responsible international collaboration and application of innovative technologies via multidisciplinary One Health approaches. In closing, I want to state above all, the nation is counting on a strong biodefense and health security leadership with a national leadership structure to drive effective coordination, collaboration, and innovation. This includes implementation of effective microbial science and technologies that were hastily pulled together to support the Amerithrax investigation 20 years ago, with far too little attention since then. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before this hearing. I'll look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Dr. Imperali for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Chairwoman Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to meet with you today to discuss this important topic. I will focus on the need to maintain and invest in a strong life sciences research program to tackle future pandemics, including determining attribution. The life science research enterprise in the U.S. is second to none, providing understanding of and cures for diseases, supporting more than 500,000 jobs, and contributing in many other ways to the economy. Much of this success can be traced to recommendations made in 1945 by Vannevar Bush, the first presidential science advisor. He recognized that federal funding of research at universities would amplify the return on investment. Not only would cutting-edge research get done, but students would be involved and they would go on to become the next generation of scientists. The results of this strategy are no better illustrated than by our response to COVID-19. In the spring of 2020, hundreds of university laboratories pivoted their efforts to tackle this disease. Government and private sector investments in Operation Warp Speed spurred new public-private partnerships. Working from the extremely strong foundation laid by decades-long U.S. government investments in basic research, we made tremendous progress in a short period of time. We were vaccinating people before the end of the year. Monoclonal antibody and drug therapy soon followed. We must acknowledge the hard work and creativity of thousands of scientists in the U.S. and around the world. These ongoing efforts are allowing us to emerge from the pandemic relatively quickly. The loss of life and effects on the economy could have been much worse. Recognition of these substantial accomplishments is taking a backseat to concerns about the possibility that another pandemic may arise due to inadvertent release of a pathogen from a laboratory that is working to protect us from these threats. Some even contend that scientists are not considering the potential risks. Scientists are committed to biosafety. In the 1970s, it was concerned scientists who assembled a group of experts to debate the benefits and risks of recombinant DNA, leading to guidelines for safe conduct of this work. Infectious disease researchers prioritize biosafety because we know the harm these agents can cause to ourselves and our communities. This is why we study infectious agents. We work with biosafety professionals to implement the appropriate equipment and procedures to perform the work safely. Through increased research and investment in applied biosafety, we can continue to improve in this area. A related concern about potential risks of studying pathogens surrounds the concept of gain-of-function experiments. Gain-of-function covers a broad area of experimentation in which, as the term states, an organism is given or acquires a new property. In the vast majority of cases, these properties are innocuous or indeed beneficial. Engineering bacteria to synthesize insulin has greatly facilitated its production and its use in millions of patients. This is gain-of-function research. Nature does this experiment all the time. Antibiotic resistance is a gain-of-function. There is value in gain-of-function research. The question is how we address concerns that an experiment might result in a pathogen with potential to cause severe harm or even a pandemic if it gets out of the laboratory, either accidentally or through malfeasance. Clearly, such research needs careful consideration. These experiments should only be performed when they are addressing a significant biomedical question of pressing concern. Other approaches are not available or are severely suboptimal, and the work can be performed safely. To conclude, I'd like to return to where I began. The U.S. science research enterprise has been so successful because of the investments you and your predecessors have made, allowing the best scientists to contribute to the betterment of humankind and saving countless lives. Regardless of the origin of the next pandemic, we must invest in a strong public health infrastructure that will allow for surveillance for the next threat and a robust response when that threat arises. The scientific community understands the responsibility it has to the public, who both fund our research and are the recipients of the benefits of that research. Other countries see the success of our strategy and are copying it. Now their research programs are thriving. To ensure that the U.S. maintains its prominence in performing this life-saving research, we must be careful not to throw sand in the gears that may slow our progress, dissuade U.S. scientists from conducting this research, or discourage young people in our country from being a part of our amazing scientific system. And we absolutely must continue this research. This is the only way we will be better prepared the next time an infectious agent jumps from nature into the human population. Our national and economic security depend on our continued leadership in life sciences research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That now concludes our opening statements. This time, I would ask unanimous consent of the committee for the following Energy and Commerce Committee members to be allowed to participate in today's hearing in keeping with our tradition. Representative Carter, Representative Miller Meeks, and Representative Dingell have asked to waive on, and without objection, that will be the order of the day. As a reminder, these members will be recognized to ask questions after all other subcommittee members have been recognized. All right, point of order just for a second, so that folks know my philosophy on this committee. I believe our job is to get the facts. Obviously, that requires a lot of information. So we will aggressively pursue getting facts so this committee can make decisions. And once we have the facts, documents, and data, then we can have our disagreements based on our philosophical perspective. Now, that should not intimidate young research scientists. It should not intimidate people in telecom or in energy in any of the areas that we're going into. But sometimes research shows us things that we weren't expecting to find, and sometimes that can be controversial. And I was sitting up here listening and immediately thought of Galileo and Copernicus. So we need the research. Sometimes we'll get answers that we like, sometimes we'll get answers that we don't like. All right, that being said, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the questioning phase of this hearing. Dr. Imperali, please explain the difference in intentional modifications of pathogens created using genetic engineering and serial passaging, which gets to your gain-of-function part of your testimony just now.
Yes, so deliberate engineering requires some sort of forethought and knowledge as to what types of changes need to be made to achieve whatever the goal of that experiment might be, right? So it's really kind of a deliberate attempt to modify an organism whereas successive passaging, you're selecting for a phenotype, right, or a behavior of that pathogen, and we don't know necessarily from the outset what that's going to be. You know, sometimes we're trying to achieve a specific goal, but the results are always not what we anticipate.
And so, and I liked your definition of gain of function. I think that's easy for people to understand. So both of these, in certain circumstances, certainly genetic engineering, but also serial passaging, could be gain of function type research. Isn't that true?
That's correct, but what I wanted to make the point is that not all gain of function research is going to make something more dangerous.
Oh, absolutely, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it. We just got to be careful with it. Do you know if they were doing either of these intentional modifications at the Wuhan laboratory?
I do not. I'm not that familiar with
Fair
the
enough.
work that was going on there.
Do you know if they are doing or were doing either of these intentional modifications on monkeypox at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within the NIH?
I also do not know that.
Okay, does anybody know the answer to those questions? It's fine if you don't. I'm just trying to get info. Sometimes you got to ask the question to find out. All right. Dr. George.
Chair,
Oh, yes.
I don't know. I don't
Dr.
have a
England.
personal understanding of what happened regarding the monkeypox research you talked about, but there's a public account of that in Science Magazine, which describes work combining different clades of monkeypox, characteristics of one clade which was more virulent with one clade that's more transmissible.
Thank you very much. You just gave a homework assignment to my staff. Find me the article. They'll do that. Dr. George, based on the track record of the Chinese Communist Party's government, we really can't rely on them giving us early case data in a potential pandemic situation. Accordingly, should we allow any of our U.S. research dollars on potential pandemic pathogens to go to institutions that are predominantly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I would say two things. First, it's not just China that doesn't do a great job of reporting out. Many countries don't for many various reasons. Secondly, I would say when it comes to issuing grants, whether they're federal grants or somebody else's grants, the government has the opportunity to put in a requirement in advance. It can be a requirement for anything, and they could put in a requirement to say, in order to get
Okay,
these grant
so
dollars,
that leads me to another question that's down the list a little ways. We had that in our dollars that were sent to, ultimately ended up in the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth Alliance, and NIH didn't properly monitor it. So do we need additional teeth in addition to your recommendation that we have somebody who's the point person in a team to make sure that we have people taking a look at these things when we're dealing with dangerous pathogens?
I think we need to make sure that we're emphasizing biosurveillance throughout the world, and this is part of it.
Yes, ma'am. And let me say, I really appreciated your comment that it's not just the Chinese Communist Party that's got issues. There were lots of organizations, and that's why in my opening statement I said government. I included the Chinese specifically, but I also referenced other governmental entities because this is a problem that we need to get straightened out worldwide, and I appreciate your testimony on that as well. Okay, Dr. Howard, according to the GAO report, it was stated that we need more early samples from those with potential pandemic disease to be effective in determining pandemic origins. How do we better address this issue to ensure the foreign countries comply with what we were just talking about and getting us that data?
As we mentioned in our report, we do recommend and have proposed policy options that would encourage the development of multilateral agreements in advance of any pandemic that would encourage multinational sharing of samples and data. That would hopefully help address that issue.
Do they respond to financial negatives if they don't? Is that something that works in that community?
The experts we spoke with did mention to us that there are incentives that might be useful in some cases.
I'm looking at negative incentives, but I appreciated my time's up, and I yield back to myself. And now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again to all of our witnesses. You've really helped set the table for an examination of the tools we need to prevent the next pandemic. And I heard you loud and clear. Good leadership and good science are essential in preventing and responding to pandemics. I guess simply put, understanding the origin of pandemics can help us prevent the next one. For example, understanding the origin of SARS, MERS, and H1N1, that was critical in jump-starting the scientific community's response to COVID-19. Dr. Imperiali, in a recent piece in the Journal of Virology, you wrote that when we were facing a colossal crisis in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, scientists were able to draw on previous research on coronaviruses to understand SARS-CoV-2 more quickly. This in turn saved lives and prevented further economic destruction by facilitating the rapid development of vaccines, tests, therapies. We really got shots in the arms in a record time. How did researchers' understanding of the origins of prior coronaviruses help the scientific community understand COVID, and what impact did it have on the nation that was struggling to confront this pandemic?
Thank you. I think the main impact there was that since we knew where those previous viruses came from, it sort of gave us the obvious place to look for the origins of the current coronavirus, because we know that these viruses exist in certain places in nature, in bats in particular. They generally move through an intermediate host before they can jump into the human population. And so using that foundational knowledge, we were able to then kind of look for the places where it was most likely to have arisen.
And Dr. Inglesby, how does knowing the origin of a pandemic contribute to an effective public health response and help policymakers know how to best protect the public from a pandemic disease?
Yeah, well, I think the more that we have confidence in the source of a future biological event, the more that we can develop strategy to try and prevent future events along the same line. So if there's an animal husbandry practice that has in some way resulted in an epidemic or a biological event, then that could be changed. Similarly, if there's a laboratory practice, that could be changed. So I think the more that we understand where it came from, the more that we have a chance of trying to diminishing the risks for that particular source in the future.
And the GAO details in its report there are many challenges to determining the origin of a pathogen. They found that such investigations take time, noting that it took approximately 13 years to determine the origin of the 2002-2003 SARS pandemic. Dr. Imperiali, in a 2021 report, you stated, in the absence of clear-cut answers, we need to continue to study these viruses because science is the best defense against pandemics. So how can we make sure that the scientific community has the resources, and how important, we're going to focus on the genomic sequencing, but it seems like still the very basic data gathering on the ground of samples and just having that skilled workforce and collaboration with scientists and epidemiologists around the globe will remain vital to preventing future pandemics.
So first and foremost, Congress has to maintain its strong support for research in our nation if we want to be able to continue to learn more about these pathogens and learn more about the characteristics that allow them to infect humans. And that then will inform what we should be looking for in terms of what's out there in nature and what we should be thinking about in terms of what's being worked on in laboratories. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that we have to continue to increase our knowledge. And I think we also have to make investments in more work where we can start to be able to better predict what the characteristics are of a virus that may allow us to make that jump and be virulent and be transmissible and have all these properties that are that we're concerned about. We don't have good computational tools at the present time to be able to just take a sequence from a virus and say, oh yeah, based on that sequence, I know exactly how that's going to behave. Oftentimes, we have to do the experiment in the laboratory to understand that behavior.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Chairwoman McMorris Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you everyone for being here and sharing your insights. I wanted to start with Dr. Inglesby. You know, there does not appear to be a single office within the United States government that owns the challenge of bioattribution. How would having one official who can be held accountable in the United States government for coordinating the federal efforts on determining attribution make a difference in the effort to investigate the origins of pandemics?
Well, I mean, I think as a general principle, the more that we understand who's responsible for the strategy, the budget, the execution of a program, the more that we increase the chances of success and forward progress. I think right now, the National Biodefense Strategy does identify key agencies, which I think is a big step forward and didn't really exist before, so that is a big step. But there are many agencies, as we've talked about here, there are many agencies that are involved and have important responsibilities, and ultimately that, I think the ideal case would roll up to a single office that then could coordinate there are science parts of this process, investigative parts of this, there's science diplomacy internationally. So ultimately, it is going to require the efforts of many agencies and offices, but if we have one central place where this is responsible, one leader for responsibility, I think there's a higher chance of success and more rapid forward movement.
Thank you. You referenced the administration's National Biodefense Strategy. It does not include the National Institutes of Health. It includes a lot of agencies, but not the national, at least NIH is not listed. Given the vast networks that NIH has within the research community and the connections of the NIH internationally, shouldn't the NIH be playing a role in the federal efforts to investigate pandemic origins?
Yes, I do. I assumed that when HHS was identified as the lead agency in this strategy, that would include elements of NIH science as part of that. CDC is also included, but you're right, it isn't listed articulated, and I do think it would be certainly a big part of it.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, this is a question to each of the witnesses. I'll start with Dr. Howard. Does the science exist to know from looking at the genetic sequence whether a pandemic had a natural origin or came from a laboratory?
With certainty, no.
Okay.
In most cases, when you look at the results of a pandemic origin investigation, they talk about likely origin, and the science, the community is comfortable with where they land, but very rarely would they say they're certain.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there's almost two questions. There are two questions of different levels of complexity. The first is natural versus engineered, and then the second question is, if engineered, where on earth did it come from? Mm-hmm. And both of those questions are very hard, and I think most scientists will agree that it is even the first question, natural versus engineered, can be very difficult to determine just from sequence, because engineering is sophisticated enough so that it is possible to obscure the signals of engineering. I'm sure Dr. Imperiale would have more to say about that, but that's the view.
Great, thank you. Dr. George?
I would say that I agree with my colleagues, and also when we're talking about investigations, any kind of investigation, that's just one piece of information. It would be like asking, well, if we have fingerprint evidence, is that enough to say for sure somebody did something? We would always say that we need a lot of data from a lot of different sources that come together to make that determination.
Thank you.
You know, I'll use the anthrax letter example, and that was the case where there was a lot of genomic sequence information of the anthrax strain, but it took all the other investigative pieces of information that finally allowed the FBI to make the conclusion that they did.
Thank you.
I would agree that right now we can't say with certainty what the origin was, but I think that the vast majority of the evidence right now points towards a natural exposure in Wuhan that did not occur in the laboratory, and I could go through a very long laundry list of the evidence for and against that, but I won't do that. But I want to just remind the committee that scientific knowledge is provisional, right? So we learn things and we come to a conclusion, and then we learn more and we modify our conclusions, and that's the way that this.
Thank you. I have one more question I want to get to. Federal government funds virus hunting activities in the field where researchers come into contact with bats harboring unknown viruses. Do these research activities pose a risk of human spillover? And I wanted to ask Dr. Parker that question.
Well, I would say certainly of the people who are not collecting the viruses are wearing proper PPE and adhering to all the safety requirements. So that's a must that they need to do that. And there's too many examples that we've seen that maybe that's not happening, particularly I would say in low middle income countries.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Democrats on this committee have long prioritized a holistic response to pandemic preparedness and response. And over the past 2 years, we've taken steps to foster a resilient public health workforce, protect disproportionately impacted communities, tackle the effects of climate change and zoonotic disease transmission, and empower researchers to understand how outbreaks begin and spread. Now, today's panel is well suited to help us understand how Congress can foster the type of collaboration necessary with the research community in a way that provides scientific breakthroughs while maintaining public confidence. So I wanted to ask two questions. I'll start, I don't know if I'll get to everybody, might move around, but first, let me start with Dr. Howard. But I have to tell you before I ask these two questions, when I listened to you and you explained all the pitfalls to finding things, I wondered whether we ever would find anything because there were so many sort of pitfalls that you mentioned there. But with that in mind, what are the most effective tools that Congress could be providing the research community so that we can better identify the origins of pandemics and maybe get around some of the pitfalls that you mentioned? And then secondly, how can we use those findings to benefit the health and well-being of the public?
The policy options that we propose in our report are intended to address those same challenges that I enumerated in my statement. So, for example, developing better database interfaces, standardized processes so that researchers can work across a range of databases in a more efficient manner, incentivizing the retention and training of the experienced workforce that we need. And we really do believe that a national strategy would be very helpful, a strategy focused on pandemic origin investigations. It's easy in the larger world of biodefense for pandemic origin investigations to get lost a little bit as a very specific subset. And we believe that a strategy that is targeted toward those investigations would be more effective.
All right. Well, now, since you, the Dr. Imperiali, sort of volunteered there that you thought that this, or that the evidence shows that this started in Wuhan, but not in a lab, I asked you the same questions. In other words, again, are there more effective tools that Congress could be providing the research community so we can better identify origins, particularly in light of what you just said about COVID? And again, how can we use those findings to benefit the health and well-being of Americans?
I agree very much with what my colleague just said. I think the Congress can invest in better tools with which to do surveillance, better tools to which to analyze the data. We're really good at collecting data, but we're not quite as good as really figuring out how to pull the relevant information out of those data to make informed decisions. So those are two of the areas that I would recommend.
I guess I'll just go to the others. Dr. George, perhaps, same questions.
Mr. Pallone, we could give you a list of all the nifty things that are out there that could use some more investment, and we're happy to provide the committee with that. But I think we're talking about two types of investment. One would be for the science and the scientific tools that you're talking about, better genetic sequencing, better laboratory tests, and so forth. The other has to do with just the normal, everyday public health stuff that people have to do. Things that would help with epidemiology and biostatistics, things that would help with data management, data analytics, modernizing some of the systems we have that, here in the United States, some people are still using fax machines to get data around. I think, I can tell you that they probably need some computers and some connectivity to switch over to something else.
All right, let me just ask Dr. Imperial, there's less than a minute left. What kind of long-term investments by Congress are necessary to help researchers and public health officials prepare for or respond to prevent the next pandemic?
So I think that one of the main responsibilities of any government is to protect its citizens. And we put a lot of effort into our Department of Defense in protecting us from those kinds of threats. But I think we don't put the same sort of emphasis into our public health infrastructure to protect us from not just these kinds of events, but the everyday sorts of medical occurrences that we need better work on for our people. So I think we need to really make a strong investment in public health infrastructure. And as you know, right, public health infrastructure is distributed. There's the federal part of it, there's state, there's local, and there's got to be a better way then to figure out how to coordinate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Yields back. Now I recognize Dr. Burgess from Texas for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Parker, so glad to have you here today. As a fellow Texan, you get it that you never want to attribute anything to coincidence if there's a natural explanation in conspiracy theory. So you provided us the 4 instances where you cataloged the unnatural outbreak examples in your written testimony. And I just wondered, after reading those, and I appreciate you providing those to the committee, and what are your thoughts on what happened or didn't happen at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Well, first, I provided those examples because I think they provided some examples and insights on past precedent for the challenges with unnatural outbreaks and some of the issues that get to what I think are the real challenges for understanding how to investigate and attribute in the international stage. And that is the lack of the inherent limitations, say, in the WHO. They have to be invited into a member state. Same with the BWC. And in fact, the BWC really doesn't apply to a natural outbreak. But they give some insights also to the behavior characteristics like denial, deflection, obstruction, that are hard to overcome when we're thinking about the future and how we're going to solve some of these things in the problem. And in my written testimony, my written testimony stands for the record, and both hypotheses are plausible, and I think that's where I'll leave it.
Well, you wouldn't have known, like the 1977 Russian flu outbreak, it was only much later in the timeline that you learned because someone came forward who wasn't forthcoming in 1977. Is that correct?
Confession is another characteristic. In the Rosh-Nice bioterror incident in the United States, that's another incident of confession that happened much later. In fact, that incident, it was attributed to a normal foodborne illness. There was some suspicions that it might be bioterror or intentional, and it wasn't until a devoted cult member admitted almost a year later, and the FBI came back in and investigated and determined that the cult member was telling the truth.
And then there was a further incident in the former Soviet Union with anthrax that did not come to light until, I guess, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and someone came forward?
It was after the breakup of the Soviet Union. It happened in 1979 in Sverdlovsk. That was essentially a maintenance issue that somebody left the HEPA filter out, according to the person who debriefed the intelligence community in the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And for over a decade, it was a campaign of deflection, denial, obfuscation, until a defector came out and debriefed and determined it was a malfunction in inhalational anthrax, not contaminated meat.
Well, it's, you just, I think the point is that in spite of everything that we put into it, maybe you come back to the Jon Stewart theory. You have an outbreak of chocolatey goodness in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and maybe the culprit is the chocolate factory, not a steam shovel mating with a cocoa bean. I mean, there is that aspect of it. This thing seemed to line up that, and look, I'll share with you, I was very concerned about this early on in the sequence of the pandemic. In fact, several of us on the Doctors Caucus had a classified briefing down in the SCIF to ask that very question. Is this truly just a novel coronavirus that has now come upon the scene? And we were assured by everyone who was there at that briefing that that was indeed the case, that there was no cause for concern. I didn't know about your 4 cases at that time, or I might have been much more suspicious than I was.
Well, they're not my 4 cases, but
right, the 4 cases that you've brought to the committee, and I appreciate you doing that. Back in the first bird flu, in 2005, I had the opportunity to go to Geneva, Switzerland, and talk to the good people at the World Health Organization. And I will tell you, my takeaway from that was that if it were not for the United States Center for Disease Control, there wasn't much there for the World Health Organization and their global outbreak alert and response network. It was really the boots on the ground as far as providing us protection from a global perspective, but it was CDC personnel that would not, my opinion, that would not have existed in the World Health Organization just by itself.
Agreed.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you very much. So I'm just concerned that in the conversations that are around the potential risks of certain research, that is created, that there's been these myths around virologists and their research, and these inaccurate portrayals undermine our broad goal of protecting the public and their health, and I'm just concerned that we go down the wrong path. Let me get it right. Dr. Imperiati, thank you. So you actually recently wrote that the current discussion on the origin of COVID-19 ushered in, and I quote, ill-informed condemnation of virology. And I'm wondering if you can describe the type of research that's been happening around, including the research that you're doing at the University of Michigan, and why some of the myths that are surrounding these discussions are inaccurate.
Thank you. So I think there are two things that contribute to this inaccuracy. The first is, again, this debate about whether it was a natural exposure or a lab leak. Just by saying the possibility that there was a lab leak immediately throws suspicion on the research community. So there's that part of it. And then there was this other issue that I mentioned about gain-of-function experiments and whether those were being done or not. And that also then basically led to this word out there, and it wasn't just a kind of a rational debate, which has been going on for many years, but now social media, the traditional media, saying that, you know, there are these scientists out there and they're doing these Wild West experiments with no consideration of what the potential risks are for those experiments. And I can tell you that, first of all, that's not true. We care very much about those risks, as I mentioned earlier. But moreover, what I'm concerned about is that I have a number of colleagues who study these viruses, these very viruses that may cause the next pandemic, who are receiving threats on their lives because of this misinformation that's out there about virologists just not doing the right thing. And that very much concerns me, because if those individuals get discouraged from continuing this type of research, and if that sort of behavior discourages young people from entering into the field, that's going to leave us in a less better place in the future.
So let me ask you this too. In a paper you wrote, you warned that while maybe some changes need to be improved or reassessed, that we have to watch out for unintended consequences. And could you describe, so what are those unintended consequences that we have to watch out for?
Sure. So, so first of all, we should always be improving the way we do things in general, but certainly it applies to the safety of our laboratory research. So there's no doubt there. One of the most fascinating things about science is we have a hypothesis and we do an experiment and we get a result that's completely out there that we did not anticipate at all. And that's really exciting sometimes. But I can imagine where that type of result could mean, hey, look, we just created something that might be dangerous. And so we have to always be cognizant that we might get that unanticipated result. and then be taking the appropriate responsible actions to figure out what do we do now with that information.
Have you seen any of those kinds of consequences? Are there students, are there researchers who are discouraged by this conversation to get involved?
I don't know of any specific examples, but I know about 10 years ago when we were having these discussions about the H5N1 transmissibility experiments, that a colleague of mine did a survey of students, and many of them indicated that this was causing them to rethink whether they wanted to go into these areas of research.
I think that's a shame, and I yield back.
Channel A yields back. Now recognize Mr. Palmer for his 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here today. I'll pull back from the microphone a little bit. There seems to be an echo. I'm going to go a little bit different direction here. I've got some concerns about organizations, agencies that are responsible for protecting the public and the world really from pandemics like this. And Taiwan reported as early as late December of 2019 concerns of human-to-human transmission. They submitted an inquiry to WHO that really wasn't transmitted to the rest of the world in a timely manner. And I just wonder, and Dr. Howard, you talked about early access to as many sequences of the virus. I don't think anybody would argue that it is extremely important that when there's concerns like this, that everyone should have been informed. And we should be concerned about any organization that is responsible for protecting us from things like this being intimidated into withholding that information.
As we noted in our policy options, we do think it's really important that that national strategy does assign roles and responsibilities for the various stakeholders. Who's going to be the lead? Who are the support agencies? What are their specific tasks? Who does what? And that those processes are in place in advance of a pandemic so that the protocols can immediately be activated when something like that comes into play.
Well, we've already seen instances of other pandemics, SARS, things like that, that I just don't think we're at a point now where we can ignore anyone legitimate concerns being raised. And I would say that the Taiwanese CDC, their version of the CDC, would be someone who should have legitimately been listened to, and that should have been followed up on by WHO. Your response from any of you. Obviously, I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The other concern that I have is how China has responded to us. They obviously withheld information. And there's a report, I don't know if you're familiar with it, from Internet 2.0 that indicates that the Chinese, particularly in Wuhan, were buying massive amounts of polymerase chain reaction test, PCR test, as early as May of 2019. I think it went up 5-fold in some places in Hubei province, maybe went up 10-fold. I'm not sure on that last number. But I don't know when that information first became available, but it seems to me that if they're ordering that number of tests, then the Chinese, as early as May of 2019, probably had some concerns about human-to-human transmission. Would that be a reasonable assumption?
Our report did not look at the origins of any particular pandemic. Instead, we were more forward-looking at how to address the challenges to the field as a whole. So I would defer to my other colleagues.
Dr. Howard, any of you? Am I treading in ground that you don't want to walk on? I mean,
Sir, I would just say that PCR tests and technology are used for many, many things. I don't think that one piece of evidence in and of itself can lead you directly to the Chinese knowing about this.
Well, why would they buy a 5-fold amount in that 1 month if they weren't concerned about something? And particularly, I mean, this is clearly abnormal. I don't think they were stockpiling. So I think it's something that we've got to take into account. in this, and as we go forward in looking into this, I mean, it's obvious that I don't think we can count on at any point that the Chinese are going to be forthcoming about how this started and how when they first knew it.
Mr. Palmer, I would just say I agree that this is an important piece of information that needs to be added to all the other pieces of information when we're talking about an investigation into this pandemic or any pandemic. And it really points to the need to have a variety of people involved in the investigation. Who would have found out about that? Is it somebody on the finance side? Is it somebody who's understanding supply chains or export control? That's not necessarily your public health person, over at the CDC. It's not necessarily a scientist at NIH. So it points to the need to have a varied group of people involved in the investigation.
You just, I think, validated the point I'm trying to make. This has got to be a broad-ranging investigation. That, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to raise these questions.
Thank the gentleman. He yields back and now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on taking the gavel, and congratulations to our ranking member. I know you're going to do a wonderful job, Kathy, and I'm happy you're there at the helm. As the chairman alluded to earlier, we had a number of investigations on the source of the coronavirus, and we did have blockages because it's difficult to get information from China. And that's why, Dr. Howard, I was really happy to see your report where you're looking forward about what we can do in the future. But I was also very intrigued, Dr. Imperiale, to hear you responding to Congresswoman Schakowsky's questions about the politicization of this research, because this is very, I think you'll agree with me, this research is really important towards developing vaccines and other ways to combat future unknown pandemics. Wouldn't that be accurate to say?
Very much so.
And Dr. Parker, I saw you nodding along when Congresswoman Schakowsky was asking about this politicization. I'm wondering if you can expand on your views on that.
Sure, I think it's extremely unfortunate this has become so politicized and acrimonious. It's very, very unfortunate. And I agree with Dr. Imperiale that the vast majority, almost all of our scientists and virologists are responsible individuals. They're responsible scientists. But we still, our biocontainment, our biosafety enterprise has been evolving over the last 40, 50 years. Probably the most significant was the 1974, 1975 that was mentioned when we first began to put guidance in for genetic engineering. And we've evolved over those years, and we're in an evolving point right now with the NSABB released a report last week that addresses some of these issues with research that might generate an enhanced potential pandemic pathogen.
And when we have, I guess I would ask the two of you, when we have this politicization of a pandemic like this, that's really going to inhibit, and again, Dr. Imperiale, you talked about that a little bit. It's going to inhibit our ability to, in a thoughtful way, develop the research that we need to prevent and treat it. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
Well, I hope not. But we've got to get rid of this acrimonious, debate and discussion. But we also have to look and try to figure as the best we possibly can. How did SARS-2 emerge?
Right.
I mean, we cannot ignore that. How did SARS-2 emerge? We owe that to the American public and the rest of the world to try to understand the best of our ability. We may not ultimately get dispositive or definitive information, but we need to understand it as best we can. But we need to do that in a way that's not so acrimonious.
I completely agree with you, and I think it's a frustrating endeavor because you are dealing with and the chairman and I have talked about this many a time. You're dealing with a country, the country from which it emerged, which is not which is opaque. It's not transparent. And so the WHO and everybody else has been doing yeoman's work trying to get this information, but we may never have definitive information. Instead, in my view, what we should be doing is what Dr. Howard and the GAO are recommending, and frankly, the scientific community at large, which is developing these strict guidelines, and the U.S. can develop strict guidelines for how we deal with labs doing this research. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's very important the United States actually demonstrate some leadership in biosafety, biosecurity, and research with enhanced potential pandemic pathogens. That's been something that's been kind of a gap for quite some time, and so I think we're at a point too. If we can try to improve our own policies here in the United States, and we're in a better position to provide leadership worldwide, because really the issue is on the international stage.
That's right.
I have complete confidence actually in our labs in the United States and our high containment enterprise. It's not perfect, but I have a much more confidence than around the world. But,
Right.
But
Dr. Imperiali, do you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think we have to play a leadership role here. I've not seen containment facilities outside of the U.S., but I've heard anecdotal stories that they do not adhere to the same standards that we do. And we have to remember this has to be an international effort to study these organisms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. And now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the recognition. And I apologize. I like to listen to all the testimony and then try to form my questions from that. We also have another subcommittee that was meeting, which I chair, so my obligation was to be there most of the time. But I did get to hear, and it's the health subcommittee, so it's important what we're talking about today. I did hear a little bit of Dr. Imperiali's testimony and about gain-of-function research, because, we need to ban what needs to be banned, and we need to, and you defined it, it's been defined so differently. And I remember I was going to have it wasn't in a public setting, we didn't have hearings with some of the more prominent people you see in NIH. I had a private phone call, and I was kind of advised when I was going to talk to him, says if you ask them about gain-of-function research, they're going to say no. But if you say, could have anything been done to the virus, if it came from a bat to a human, could anything been done anywhere artificially in a lab or so forth that happened? And just kind of broaden it where they said that's possible. That was the time when you were still banned from Twitter if you thought it came from the Wuhan lab. And so, it kind of gets to if somebody says, is this gain-of-function research? It's so technical, some people can say no, when 99% of America would say, yeah, that was gain-of-function research in the way that we want to define it. So I guess what I'm getting at, we've got to do some reforms with NIH and CDC and others. And could I just maybe get I think Dr. Imperiali, you even said, I heard you say that this is gain-of-function research. I can't remember exactly what you said. And that's okay, but this others is and it's not. And so it just seems, or can just go down the panel, start with you. Can you give a concise or reasonable definition in layman's terms? I'm not a scientist, of what gain-of-function research is and what it's not.
Sure. So gain-of-function research is any research in which an organism or a cell or a virus or a bacterium acquires a new function. Mm-hmm. Okay, so antibiotic resistance is an example.
That's right.
That's not research, but that's natural. So much of this research is very innocuous. A lot of genetics labs do this kind of research all the time to try to understand functions of genes, things like that. But there is a small fraction of this research that involves these types of pathogens that we're talking about today that does need added consideration as to whether it should be done and can it be done safely. Mm-hmm. So that would be my definition.
If any of you have anything to add, I would love to hear different perspectives. But yeah,
no, I totally agree with that, and it is a confusing definition. But by far, the vast majority of research that virology or other biologists will do with gain of function is actually helpful. It is that very small subset that could possibly generate a pandemic potential pathogen that requires additional consideration.
But you don't stumble onto that, right? When you're going into your research, you could say, well, I know I'm going to study a gene to see if I can gain its function so it'll go kill cancer cells. I mean, but you know going in that you're risking. Is it riskable, or could it be, wow, I stumbled upon this?
It depends on the research and the goals of the research and so forth. But yes, the investigator should have that, I'll use the definition in the policy, reasonable anticipation, which is, hard to define too. But they would have some reasonable anticipation that it could. And when they're thinking about that and proposing that type of research, it should require more conversation, and hopefully that conversation starts at the PI level, because the PI in the institution, I think, actually knows more about the research and the way to mitigate risk at that level. But if it could potentially generate, then it ought to be reviewed at the funding level and maybe reviewed at the department level too, because the consequences could be so great.
Should the funding agency do the review, or should it be independent?
I believe the review ought to be from the continuum, from the institution, the funding agency, and it really could generate an EPP, or enhanced potential pathogen, then the department level should review it as well, as a final review. Now, the review continuum and the processes and procedures need to be better streamlined.
Okay.
So they're not delayed, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and the benefits really need to be clarified, that as was said, that the research truly, if it could generate a potential.
I'm kind of running out of time, but Dr. Inglesby, you look like you're ready to say something. That's
I was just going to say that the science community
Don't mean to
has been talking about this for the last years, has in general moved away from that term gain of function because it does encompass so much, and really focused on this term enhanced potential pandemic pathogen research. If a researcher proposes to make a pathogen more transmissible or more virulent, or if that could be the result of the work, that's the area of work where I think we all have a lot of concern about making sure that we do it right and do it safely. But it's a very, very specific area of work. It's not gain of function writ large.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That's very enlightening, and I appreciate your time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Danko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While most viruses emerge from outside the U.S., viruses know no borders, as we all know. As a result, much virus-related research takes place in other countries. Ensuring that American scientists can collaborate internationally in research strengthens the health and economic security of the American public, and also allows us to answer critical questions about where pandemics originate. According to Dr. Howard's testimony, GAO has found that while researchers already have the technologies to determine the origins of a pandemic, better international collaboration is necessary if we want to get evidence-based answers about how pandemics indeed start. So, Dr. Howard, how would improving international collaboration increase our ability to determine the origins of a pandemic?
The policy option that we proposed in our report was to proactively establish multinational agreements on data sharing, sample sharing, and roles and responsibilities in the event of a pandemic origin investigation, the outbreak of a pandemic.
Thank you. And I can imagine such collaboration can also be useful in other aspects of pandemic research and response. Dr. Imperial, how do the American people benefit from collaboration with researchers abroad, and what tangible scientific advancements in pandemic preparedness and response have been made through international collaboration?
We benefit from collaboration because it's the nature of how science has become in the modern age. No one laboratory really has the ability to address all aspects of any given question that needs to be answered in order to develop these approaches. And so we need that sort of collaboration. And oftentimes those collaborators are not within the United States. And so the way these collaborations started, they're very organic. I will read the literature and I'll see, researcher X in country Y is working on the same sort of thing, and I will reach out to that person and say, do you want to collaborate? So we have to be able to take advantage of the global expertise that's available here.
Mm-hmm. And we need, I would think, to ensure that virus-related research outside of the U.S. is done safely. So, Dr. Inglesby, you have written extensively about the need to thoughtfully balance investments in international research capable of generating scientific breakthroughs with concerns about national security and public safety. So how can the U.S. work productively and constructively with governments and researchers abroad to ensure that research is being conducted safely?
Well, I think one major step forward is the policy review process underway right now. The White House, NIH are leading with the input of NSABB and Dr. Parker. That's well along. I think we will have a stronger policy at the end of that. And I think after we have that in place, it'll be important for the U.S. to be working with other governments to ensure that they also are thinking about the risks and benefits of this kind of work. In general, international collaboration, I absolutely agree with what's already been said. International collaboration is really essential around this work to try and improve our protection against infectious disease risks. Infectious disease risks come from around the world. Scientists are doing important work around the world. The more that we know what other scientists are doing, the better we will do, the more we're engaged in the event there's a crisis, and we have personal connections or collaborations underway that can help. But in that very particular area of dual-use research and enhanced potential pandemic pathogen research, that's where we should be working as a government with other governments to try and develop a common approach to dealing with this in the time ahead. Because the U.S. has been ahead of other governments, and I think it would be useful to help other governments think about it.
Okay. Are there any barriers from the other countries joining in that international compact?
I think some countries are much less likely to be interested in sharing data than others. We talked a bit about that already, but the more that we have scientific collaboration going, the more chance we have, I think, around sharing data. And there is now the beginning of this pandemic treaty negotiation that's going on in Geneva, and part of that is a discussion about how we can share data better around the beginning, possible epidemic origins.
Sounds encouraging. I do hope that we can continue to have a rigorous conversation about biosecurity and investigating the origins of pandemics. We ensure that well-founded concerns about safety are addressed alongside the need for critical collaboration with our international partners. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I yield back. You've been...
I switched on you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to call on myself. I'm Debbie Lesko from Arizona. And first, I want to thank all of you. Very informative, very complicated issue, but very important issue. My first question is for Dr. Parker. On September 12, 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology took down its online depository of data on viral sequences. The database was intermittently accessible from December 2019 to February 2020 before being permanently taken offline in February of 2020. Do you think that the U.S. should continue to fund any type of research that they were doing in the Wuhan Institute on the virus in China?
Well, first, I don't have any more information than you have on the database, but I have read that U.S. funds probably contributed some to that database, so that certainly raises question as if we contributed some funds to that, not all, but some funds, we should have access to that database.
I agree. Dr. George, I have a question for you. It has come to light through Freedom of Information Act litigation that State Department cables from our Beijing embassy in March of 2018 warned that biosafety practices at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were inadequate. Yet, there is no evidence that information reached NIH, who continued to fund research at the WIV. How can we ensure better coordination and information sharing?
Madam Vice Chair, it's an excellent question. There are all kinds of examples of what you just gave with all different departments and agencies. People picking up on something, maybe communicating to somebody else, and then that information doesn't go anywhere else. I think that sadly, because of COVID, people are more sensitized now, and perhaps in the future, if somebody had that same sort of assessment, even if they thought, gee, I'm not 100% sure, I'm over here at the State Department, I think they might be more inclined to not necessarily go from an embassy or a consulate directly to NIH, but instead, at least to go all the way up to the State Department and over to HHS. That needs to happen across the entire federal government.
I agree. We certainly learned that. Dr. Parker, the GAO report cites a sampling effort in China aimed at tracing the origins of two pandemic pathogens, SARS and SARS-2, where, despite generating a database of over 17,500 animal samples, researchers did not find any closely related coronaviruses. Wouldn't you expect to find a closely related coronavirus?
Excuse me. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that data or that report from the GAO report, so I'm not sure if I should comment on that.
Okay. Anyone else have any do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would add that, yeah, we have not yet found a virus that's an exact match to SARS-CoV-2, right, that arose in the early part of the pandemic. But the epidemiological data of where the cases clustered early on all point towards the live animal market in Wuhan. I can also tell you that there's no evidence that the Wuhan lab was working on any virus that has a sequence that's close enough to SARS-CoV-2 to say that it arose from there. So sequence data here, based on what we have, is not helping. And as someone mentioned earlier, it took us over 10 years to find the exact match to the first SARS.
Thank you. Dr. Parker, do you have any doubt that COVID-19 emerged in China?
All the genomic data points back to Wuhan.
Thank you, and I yield back. Yes, next up I'll call on Mr. Peters from California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the benefits of being down here is that everyone's asked a lot of the questions already, but I do want to follow up on something before. I wanted to talk about biomedical research safeguards that currently exist to manage the effects of potentially risk in the United States. But I just wanted to follow up on an exchange earlier between Dr. Parker and Dr. Burgess about an anthrax outbreak in the 70s. And my understanding is that Dr. Parker, you believe that your testimony was that this occurred due to an incident in a Soviet lab. You recall that testimony?
Yes, it was a Soviet lab in Sverdlovsk.
Okay, just to be clear, how would you compare the biosecurity standards in a Soviet lab during the Cold War with U.S. standards today?
Well, I was too young to, I had not entered into the biodefense field in 1979, so it's kind of hard for me to comment on that. However, I'd say during the, after the fall of the Soviet Union, I made a number of trips to Biopreparat, the civilian equivalent of the military MOD, military defense facilities. They're good scientists, former Soviet and now Russian scientists. They're very good scientists, but their laboratories are in great disrepair at that time because they didn't have funding and because of the situation of the collapse of the government. And so we were very concerned about.
I think 1979 is a long time ago, but would it be fair to say that it's wrong to assume that they're the same, the standards? We wouldn't have evidence that they're the same, would we?
No.
Yeah, because
we didn't have eyes on the ground.
I'd be suspicious myself that they're the same, but in any event, Dr. Imperiali, maybe you could describe the steps that researchers and institutions already take to mitigate risks and design safe research projects and how they might be improved.
Right. So first of all, I can tell you that biosafety in the United States has been constantly improving over the years. I mean, the precautions that we take, the equipment that we have today are much superior than when I started as a researcher in graduate school in the late 1970s. So there's that. We also have these different levels of biocontainment, from 1, the lowest level, to 4, and we assign the appropriate level of containment based on the nature of the pathogen being worked on. And so the most dangerous pathogens are worked at with the highest level of containment. I had the opportunity to visit a BSL-4 laboratory in Boston a few years back, and it's just remarkable to me how that building was designed, the procedures they have in place to protect us. And so if the facility is designed properly and the procedures are being followed the way they are supposed to be, the chances of an accident are very, very small.
Yeah, actually, I think I saw similar things in our visit to the CDC, which we took as a committee, a lot of the same containment features. What role do you think Congress can play in making sure that the public and other policymakers are distinguishing between legitimate concerns about risks and ill-informed fears based on conspiracy theories or supposition?
Boy, that's a good question. Right, you can't legislate this,
Right.
and I guess it's more just the way that you all talk about these things when you're making statements to the publics and such to ensure that we're not overgeneralizing things. That we're again, I'll come back to the gain of function thing, right? We're not painting this whole area of research as having potential risks. Right? As Dr. Inglesby said, there's a very, very small number of experiments here where we need to be carefully considering what we're doing there. So I think it's more of it's the way the communication occurs, it's the way we talk about things, and also then when misinformation is put out there, right, pushing back against it.
Right. I'll just say I appreciate very much the witnesses. I think that this committee will be looking at ways to make sure that we're prepared next time. This is an important part of that discussion, as is making sure we're getting vaccines early, as is make sure we deal with supply chain issues that we've discovered during the pandemic. And I appreciate the hearing and the witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now I will recognize Mr. Duncan of South Carolina. And everybody needs to lean into their mics. We're having a little bit of mic problem.
Yeah, thanks. That mic was janky. If SARS-CoV-2 naturally spilled over in Wuhan, it's a heck of a coincidence. It means that SARS-CoV-2 reached Wuhan undetected and spilled over basically at the front door of China's premier coronavirus research facility without leaving behind any infected animals. WIV scientists who have been studying coronaviruses for 20-plus years never expected to have one emerge in Wuhan. Based on the research, they expected a virus like SARS-CoV-2 to emerge 1,600 miles away in a rural area of southern China. Laying aside those coincidences for a moment, if SARS-CoV-2 emerged naturally, it really seems to undermine the rationale for projects like Global Virome Project. Governments have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on researchers collecting viruses from caves and other remote areas, but it doesn't seem to have resulted in us being any better prepared. So, Dr. Peters, is there some other part of the human-animal interface we should be focusing on?
I think you meant Parker?
Parker, I'm sorry.
Well,
it's been a long day, sir. I'm sorry.
I have to admit, when I first was briefed about the Global Virome Project very specifically, actually at a conference we hosted at Texas A&M several years ago, it looked impressive. But the more I thought about it, and I talked to other people, including actually Christian Anderson was briefed the following year, and although there could be some merit to something like that, I think the available dollars that we have would be much better used at basic public health, animal health, diagnostics, surveillance, reporting systems, particularly in low, middle-income countries. And that's where some of these viruses are really going to emerge, in the low, middle-income countries and disease hotspots. And we really need to use our aid dollars, because some of this was not aid. It was using aid, development dollars, USAID. And I think the objectives of our aid dollars ought to be going to development in low, middle-income countries, and then specifically for public health and animal health capacities.
Yeah. So just as a sidebar question, we've been studying and working on Ebola. Do we have any of these type labs set up in Africa that maybe we should be concerned about viruses escaping from, or that you know of, Dr. Parker?
Certainly, I'm not sure we have actually U.S.-funded labs, but we need collaborations on the African continent with the scientists there to be on the ground. And I would say education is very important, and having an opportunity to collaborate with universities and having twinning opportunities with U.S. universities and universities that are in low, middle-income countries specifically, so that we can actually work on degree education. We do a lot of training, but training's maybe necessary but not sufficient, and what we can do to actually grow the intellectual capacity in some of these countries will be very...
But no labs that you know of that are similar to Wuhan that you're aware of?
On the African continent?
Yes, sir.
No. Well,
closer to the source of Ebola. And
South Africa has a long history and has a very distinguished scientific record in South Africa.
Right, thank you. I'm going to shift gears. As we had mentioned, academia will play a large role in bioattribution investigations. However, academics can be subject to pressure from colleagues, funding agencies, and irate members of the public who disagree with their findings. It is essential that dissenting voices not be censored or intimidated. How can Congress foster collaboration and data sharing between researchers and others in academia under those understandings, and what initiatives are currently constructive and what's non-constructive? And I'll direct that back to Dr. Parker, but if anyone would like to chime in 2 minutes.
Sure. Thank you. One, I think continue just recognition of the importance of academia and university-based research, and how university-based research needs to be fully supported, and the life sciences need to be fully supported. So I think just that recognition and continued discussion will be very helpful. Certainly funding is absolutely necessary. It can't be done without resources.
Yeah, but we see oftentimes funding directs the outcome and sometimes changes the hypothesis from the very beginning, or at least by the end date. So I know we've beat a horse here for the last couple of hours that we've been on this hearing, but I think Americans and my constituents want to make sure the United States government investigates the origin of COVID-19 that took so many lives, and it's not negating the understanding and empathy, sympathy for the lost individuals and the pain that the families felt, the strain it put on the hospitals, our healthcare workers, and whatnot. But coming to the conclusion of what happened in Wuhan, how it escaped or how it occurred naturally is very, very important. I think personally that it escaped from the lab. It wasn't natural, and that was in my initial comments. I'm glad to see what GAO has put forward. I want to wish you guys as researchers the best of luck, and as you participate and collaborate on the origins of COVID-19, so we can get an answer, so we can keep this tragedy from happening. We're never going to stop a pandemic from happening. My best friend's a doctor. He told me we were due for a pandemic, and he wasn't surprised when this one happened to sweep across the globe. But to find out that it may have been manufactured, it may have escaped the lab, is kind of alarming to so many people. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we can all agree that biomedical research is critically important to improving our understanding about how pandemics begin, developing effective vaccines and therapeutics, and creating policies to contain future outbreaks. Ensuring that research is conducted safely with robust biosecurity standards is essential to the safety of researchers and the public alike. Clear standards can help us weigh the benefits of potential research against its risk, and gives us guidance for making reasoned, evidence-based decisions about which research is appropriate and under what conditions. Dr. Imperiali, how should Congress weigh the risks that certain types of research carries against the benefits, and how can clear biosafety guidelines help in that evaluation?
I think that Congress has to listen very carefully to the experts in these areas who are doing this research, so that they can understand why we want to do these experiments, how we're going to do it, and that whether or not we've got the appropriate protocols in place to perform it safely. So I think that, a dialogue and a partnership between Congress and the research community would really go a long way here.
So I know that there are a lot of ethical boards in doing clinical research. In terms of the biomedical research, aren't there certain guidelines for safety already that exist, or do you think that we need to create more robust safety guidelines?
Yeah, very much so. As I alluded to, there are guidelines for working with recombinant DNA and also with infectious agents. These are come out of the NIH, they come out of the CDC. Institutions are required to follow those guidelines as a term and condition of federal grant support. And so we have committees that review these experiments before they're being performed. We in the laboratory look at these things very carefully before we're performing these experiments. When we propose grants, there's that review at the NIH level, and when necessary at a higher level, if it is this very specialized category. So this research is being reviewed extensively at multiple levels, and also throughout the lifespan of the research.
And so how can we, design a thoughtful biosecurity framework right, that offers robust safeguards and risk management strategies that also doesn't stifle potential innovative and biomedical breakthroughs.
Is that for me again?
Yeah,
sure. Okay, so yeah, I think it comes down to what we've all been talking about here, right? Which is that we need to first of all understand what experiments are important to do. What are the really important questions that need to be answered? So I would make the argument, if someone wants to do an experiment because they think, wow, I think this would be interesting to answer question X, but they can't convince me that there's a compelling need to answer that question, except to perhaps provide, add to our knowledge base in a more existential manner, then I think we can't take risks under those types of circumstances, right? But if there's an experiment, and even maybe a gain-of-function experiment, that is going to give us critical information that may be necessary to prevent a pandemic or develop a therapeutic or deal with antibiotic resistance in bacteria, then I think we have to be willing to maybe take a little bit higher risk because of the importance of answering that question. But we have to make sure that we've got the appropriate precautions in place to mitigate that risk and make it as minimal as possible.
So one, we have different levels of that kind of risk research at the CDC, and they have their equipment. But one of the things that Dr. Parker said was that oftentimes the higher risk locations of the origins of any pandemic are in low to middle class income countries where the risks of communicable diseases are higher. And you're talking about making sure we have safety in our protocols. Well, that's going to require collaboration with other countries, with investments in other countries to ensure that research is done at the site and identification is done at the site in order to contain it. And I just need to make a comment here that this is very important to understand that global health security is our health security, and taking an American-only approach to withdraw from other countries and global health and investing in those underserved countries is only putting ourselves at risk and doesn't meet the national security interests of our nation. So I think it's very important to understand that this requires also investments in biosecurity and infrastructure in those other countries as well. And with that, I yield back my time.
Appreciate the gentleman yielding back. Now recognize the gentleman of Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I was a little surprised to hear that the new consensus is that it's a wet market. Seemed the consensus before that, with a lot of pretty good evidence, was lab leak theory. What was the new evidence exactly? Why is it so compelling that it's no longer the Wuhan Institute of Virology's fault for their shoddy parameters and standards of cleanliness, but now it's the wet market, when that had been thoroughly debunked in late 2020 after looking at the data and testing animals in the wet market, all of that?
Yeah, so there are a few pieces of evidence there. So the first is that the epidemiological evidence, where the original clusters of cases occurred, all map to that market. Okay, so that's the first piece of evidence.
It's Chinese data, just to be clear.
No. This is U.S. data.
I just read it. It's just now.
Data.
All right, this is provided by China.
Secondly, there's evidence now that there may have been two independent introductions of the virus into the population. And the chances that two independent introductions occurred in the laboratory are pretty small. We can't rule it out, but they're pretty small. And as I mentioned before, there's absolutely no evidence that that laboratory was working with SARS-CoV-2. Okay, so we haven't found an animal with SARS-CoV-2, right? But we can apply Occam's razor here, right?
I don't know. Occam's razor says
in the past
we have a chocolate flood and there's a Hershey plant nearby. Maybe it's the Hershey plant. I don't know. So maybe we don't know. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we're arguing about things I don't think we can possibly know, which gets to my real line of questioning.
Can I make a point, though, if you don't mind?
No, I do mind, because they're giving us 4 minutes now instead of 5. So I think we don't know, and I think that's what we're trying to figure out, is how we can assure ourselves that we will know in the future. So, Dr. George, I want to go back to you now. You've called for a federal biological attribution apparatus. Multiple administrations have failed to heed this, so we wouldn't have this argument right now, right? We would have a group of a federal agency that's designated to do this. Can you talk through that? Why is that so important? Do we have the tools to do that? And is it just a matter of making sure those tools are working together for this common cause of attribution that would help policymakers?
Yes, sir, and yes, sir. I think we have a lot of tools. Of course, we could have more. We could have better technology. We have a variety of federal departments and agencies and others who are doing work in this space. You have the FBI going down one path when it comes to law enforcement issues. You've got the Department of Defense going off on another path when it comes to biological weapons. You have CDC going off on another path and looking at public health things.
And you know, does the intelligence community have a directive currently to say we need intelligence on virology labs in China? Like, would that even be on their radar? I know recently we've been successful in implementing a national intelligence manager for biological threats at the ODNI. That seems like a good step forward. So do you think that will improve things and provide those kind of requirements that I just talked about?
I think it will improve. It will improve things. However, there are more parts of the intelligence community that are addressing biological threats, and they all need to be further strengthened. I do think they have more directives now. I don't know that they're specific to virology versus bio in general, but I think that they need to be engaged sooner. I don't think we should be letting things roll down the pike and then suddenly, you know, a year, 2 years later say, gee, we think there might be something else to be gained by engaging the intelligence community and then asking them to come in belatedly.
I'm sort of out of time, but Dr. Parker, you're nodding your head like you wanted to say something, and you're from Texas A&M, so I got to let you.
Yeah, I think back, we actually only have one laboratory in the United States that was kind of built and designed for these kind of things, and that's the MBAC lab at Fort Detrick. Unfortunately, I don't think it has its same kind of mission focus as it was originally envisioned. It would be a laboratory that could support microbial forensics investigations for attribution that would support the law enforcement and intelligence community, and I think today it's probably only focused on law enforcement, which is necessary.
Well, that'll be a future question. Do we create a whole new program or agency for this, or can we build upon something that already exists?
We have to just, I think it's just we have to put the leadership focus on microbial attributions and the sciences that support that. But I don't think we need to be thinking about how this also supports multiple things. Day-to-day surveillance, genomics that can support both public health needs and the investigations that go for attribution. And Dr. George may have a different opinion than me, but that's okay.
We'll have to get that opinion later. Gentleman yields back. Recognize Mr. Armstrong for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Academia, science is going to play a huge role in how we deal with the next pandemic. Nobody should be penalized or politicized for any of these decisions. We like science. We have the greatest healthcare, the greatest food supply in the history of the world. Science is the reason for all of those things. But there's another problem to science. And it's almost like you take everything you design in order to get a real result is to eliminate confirmation bias. And then you lock everybody in their house and you give them 6 more hours a day with these little machines in their hand that are only designed to enhance their confirmation bias. And you continue to have these things continue to move forward, not the least of which it was called a novel coronavirus. So we were learning as we were going, and there's 2 different sides of this. There's the U.S. portion and the global response. But the GAO report mentions concerns over academics being subject to pressure from people who disagree with their findings. And I think it is important to acknowledge the pressures felt by academics on both sides of the COVID-19 debate. While scientists at the NIH have taken a lot of criticism over their origins theories, it was also unacceptable to see scientists and academics who argued in favor of a lab-leaked COVID-19 theory, a theory everyone at least knows now is at least viable, were censored, ridiculed, and criticized. So the criticism of academics happens on all sides of the origin question. We need to protect researchers, academics, and other professionals who are often controversial who offer controversial findings and conclusions on origin investigations from workplace consideration and retaliation. And then on the international stage, we said we have to take it, but the question is we have to take advantage of global expertise, but the second part of that question is without being taken advantage of. Dr. Parker, you said denial, deflection, obstruction. The WHO's Constitution states that the health of all people is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent on the fullest cooperation of the individual states. The problem is, for over the last 3 years, the WHO has not received the honest cooperation from the CCP in regards to investigating the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, WHO itself, veiled behind public praise for the CCP's COVID response, expressed frustration over significant delays in receiving complete information, data, and genomes related to COVID-19. WHO praised the CCP despite the CCP delaying information sharing that hamstrung global responses to the pandemic. If the WHO pursued an appeasement strategy with the CCP to get cooperation, it didn't work. Instead, we got deflection, denial, and obstruction. I think it's clear that the United States having information early is important to determine the origins so that we can respond appropriately to the next pandemic. Offline, my colleague and I here were talking about before this had ever happened, how much that early information would have really worked on the street at Dickinson, North Dakota. I am not entirely sure my constituents would have locked down before a single case got here, but it's happened now, and we know it now. And so I have one question, and I think it's important. Has the CCP's obstruction and WHO's refusal to address the obstruction set a precedent for other state actors to refuse cooperation? What can we do in the future to make sure we take advantage of the global expertise without getting taken advantage of? Dr. Parker.
That is a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I know one thing that we cannot do is walk away from the international stage and continue to engage in these discussions. I know and some of these diplomatic discussions may not lead to where we would like it to go, but we're not going to get there at all unless if we walk away from the diplomatic stage in these negotiations. Diplomacy is hard, and diplomacy in this area is very hard. But I don't think we're going to be creating another WHO or whatever, but we have to make the WHO that we have work. And that will take diplomacy and negotiations, and those negotiations should maybe first and foremost make sure that we are protecting the vital, essential United States interests.
Well, and Dr. George talked about positive reinforcements. The chair talked about negative reinforcements, but it's really important because we can't do it as a government if our citizens don't trust this. And they don't trust it right now. And there's plenty of blame to go around on that. But some of it exists with the institutions that we put in place to trust. And with that, I yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman yielding back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll jump right in. So this question has already been posed by one of my colleagues, but I want to follow up on this. It is about the GAO report, which cites the sampling effort in China that was aimed at tracing the origin of the two pandemic pathogens. Now, there was a database of 17,500 animal samples. It was said, and I think it was you, Dr. Parker, that said you weren't familiar with that report. It is page 15, last sentence, second paragraph. This states that 17,500 animal samples were used, and not one had a closely related trigger to coronavirus. I'm not a scientist, so educate me. How many animal samples would it take? Because what we're hearing today, to the point that my colleague from Texas is saying, is that this is now something from a wet lab, contrary to everything that we've been briefed on for the last 2 years.
Well, I think animal samples doesn't tell me what genomic samples are in those animal samples. I think that must be referring to the September database that went offline, perhaps. I don't know. But just because they're animal samples or clinical samples, whether they be fecal, oral, tissue samples, doesn't tell me what genomic samples were identified in there. But I think, so that.
And because we're short on time, I'm going to jump to the next one. This is for really the panel at large. How much money is invested in research projects, either in China or in collaboration with Chinese researchers? Who is responsible for tracking this research? And to the comment that was made earlier about critical communication between scientists and researchers, how do we protect United States data, health data, and populations, particularly when the Chinese government at the highest levels is suppressing information, withholding information, even to the WHO in the middle of a pandemic? Don't all jump in at once.
I do not know how much U.S. dollars is going into research at China. I'm sorry.
Okay, Dr. Parker?
Yeah, I don't know that number either, but I think that's a number that should be asked of of the federal funding agencies that work there.
Dr. George?
I think that whoever's taking a look at China's bioeconomy probably has more information about that. But I also think that on the point of the role of the Chinese federal government and what they're doing, it's not just about denial of information and sharing with other people. Let's not forget they are looking for genetic information from a whole lot of people all throughout the world with some very popular genetic tests. I think we need to broaden our awareness, and we need somebody to be paying attention to all of this.
Thank you, Dr. George.
Yeah, the really fair questions. I unfortunately don't know the funding level for the Chinese Science Enterprise. I do think collaboration between the U.S. and China has the potential to be useful in the future, but with appropriate safeguards and disclosure and accountability and transparency. I do think to your other question about how do we keep putting pressure on the system, working with other partners around the world to continue to ask for information about what happened, basically all in animal sampling and the environmental sampling and in the laboratory continues to be very important. The WHO now is in that position, is asking for that information from China. I think the Director General even a month ago said all hypotheses remain on the table. China needs to provide more additional information. And to Dr. George's last point, I completely agree that China has a strategy of acquiring genomic information from around the world, including in the U.S., but has laws against other countries acquiring genomic information from within China. And so I think we should all be playing in a level playing field and be much more aware of where our information in the bioeconomy and personal information is going, in particular to China, but to other countries.
Thank you. Dr. Howard, as quickly as you can.
Our work was not designed to look at the resources being expended on particular research.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. Seeing no other witnesses of the regular subcommittee here, I would now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, and so that the committee members will know, or so that the witnesses will know what's happening, is they've called for votes. And that's why people have been picking it up a little bit and why everybody's going to leave except myself and my colleague, the ranking member. And Buddy, who's going to ask questions. Go ahead, Buddy. You're on.
Well, thank you, first of all. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to wave on, and thank you for having this hearing as our first oversight hearing. How appropriate after suffering through the last 3 years, 2 years, or whatever, without having these type of hearings that we wanted, this subject matter. And I'll be very quick. I've just got a couple of questions. We all know, it's gone over how much this has cost us in the way of lives, how much it's cost us in money. We don't know yet the impact that the lockdowns and everything else and the lack of children going to school has had, but we know that it's going to be tremendous in the future. I want to ask you, Dr. Howard, in your work, have you ever compared oversight and compliance in U.S. taxpayer-funded research facilities in foreign countries to that in domestic institutions?
I'm not familiar with prior GAO work in that area, but we can do a little research and get back to you.
I'd appreciate that because it's my understanding that the NIH, for instance, exempts foreign animal labs from compliance with the U.S. laws. And that's very concerning, especially if they're sending money over for research in places like the Wuhan lab of virology and other labs in China and Russia. This is something that I'm very concerned about. Dr. Ingsley, I want to ask you, and this will be my last question. I'll go real quick, but thank you for being here, first of all. The Center for Health Security released a report in 2018 that was titled The Characteristics of Pandemic Pathogens. This point isn't too far in. It's the executive summary, but I think it's a good one. It says, although most classes of microbe could evolve and or be manipulated in ways that would cause a catastrophic risk to humans, viruses are the most likely class of microorganism to have this capacity. Let's assume we read nothing else in that report except for this. Can we just take that point away from this to say that we need to be most careful when with federal policy covering viral research as opposed to other research?
I think the federal policy needs to be most careful around proposals to make pathogens, in particular viruses, more transmissible or more lethal. And that's what we call enhanced potential pandemic pathogen research. I think a lot of viral research poses no obvious risk at all within the laboratory, but there is a very specific area of viral research around making viruses more transmissible, which requires, I think, very special attention, very special review by the government.
You know, I know there's a danger in generalizing, and I know y'all have defined gain-of-function research as being much more than probably what most people think of it as. But I got to tell you, I've got serious reservations. I don't think I'm the only one. I think Americans have serious reservations about this, with all due respect to research. And I do have a great respect for research. I'm a pharmacist. I went through pharmacy school, saw researchers working diligently, and what has happened through research and development in my career as a pharmacist is nothing short of miraculous. But at the same time, when we talk about gain-of-function research, I can't help but think, a quote from Einstein was, the only thing more dangerous than ignorance is arrogance. And in my opinion, gain-of-function research is nothing more than intellectual arrogance. And I think there's a real danger there, and I don't think I'm the only one who believes that. I think there are a lot of Americans right now who believe that. So having said that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to participate, and thank all of you for being here.
Thank you very much. That concludes our witnesses who have asked today. I would remind all the members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to submit their responses within 10 days of receipt of those questions. Without objection, subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.